latest weather, traffic, and news updates online at 560theanswer.com. Now, from the Signature Bank Studios, this is Chicago's Morning Answer with Dan Proft on AM 560. The Answer.
Top of the morning, Dan Proft here. There's a couple of categories of crime, it seems to me, that raise the level of consciousness about street violence in big cities, and to the extent that it metastasizes into outlying communities as well. Stories like this, where it matters, where it's not the murder du jour on the south or west side. I'm not saying this should be the case. I'm saying it is. The story last week of the smash and grab robbery at Louis Vuitton on Michigan Avenue. 7 men have been charged with felony murder. Broke into the Louis Vuitton. Of course, most of them had arrest records. One of them works as an anti-violence peacekeeper. Another one of these stories, who protects the public from the peacekeepers. This was just before 5 a.m. last Thursday morning. Several men running through the compromised storefront, smash and grab, running out with trash bags full of merchandise valued at between $500,000 and $1 million. One of the cars sped south on Michigan Avenue, slamming into an SUV on Ohio Street and killing Mark Arcetta, who was on his way to work his last shift at Northwestern University before taking paternity leave. His described as his partner. We're having a baby right now. He's supposed to be with us. They took a very loving father, really good partner, and very good dad. Michigan Avenue, main drag, Gold Coast. This is where people take notice. Another kind of category of crime where people take notice is when it is particularly barbaric and preventable in the sense that this is somebody that the crime involves somebody with a violent past, multiple time loser, just in and out. And every time he gets out, he commits another violent act. He creates another victim that sends him back in until he gets back out. This 65-year-old, 4-time convicted felon charged with murdering a woman whose remains were discovered inside a burning garage and then sexually assaulting another woman within hours after that, according to Chicago police. Predators. Irredeemable. The decision has to be made at some point. That's what gets people thinking about things like the National Guard, particularly when the response is to rationalize or contextualize this sort of barbarism, as we have our political leaders in Chicago and Illinois do. So President Trump is sending the National Guard to Memphis with the cooperation of the governor of Tennessee, as well as, I understand, the mayor of Memphis, who's a Democrat. That's interesting. And he's also still trolling Chicago about Chicago being next. May or may not be, but the point is that the more areas where he is party to increasing the peace on the streets, D.C., maybe Memphis now, hopefully Memphis now, the more it puts pressure on these other big city mayors and blue state governors to do more than offer lip service in the direction of preventable crime. But just exactly what are Americans' attitudes about crime and public safety? Maybe these politicians like a Brandon Johnson, like a J.B. Pritzker, maybe they know more politically than it appears that they know in terms of the positions they take. For more on this topic, we're pleased to be joined by Michael Baharaeen, who is the chief political analyst at the liberal Patriot. Also his Substack, Michael Baharaeen, .substack.com. Michael, thanks for joining us again. Appreciate it.
Hey, Dan. Good morning.
So, it's a fascinating piece that you wrote. So people think crime is a big problem except where they live. And that's just like almost categorical across the country. It's really incredible.
Yeah. Yeah. So what we did in this piece was we kind of broke down, essentially what do Americans actually think about crime? Well, how do they perceive it, in their own community versus the nation as a whole? And yeah, definitely at the national level, people see it as a major problem. Actually, about 2/3 of Americans do. And, it's improved. Those sentiments have improved a little bit since the kind of COVID surge where people were really concerned. But they're still really high. And what I like to say is that people think that relatively better levels of crime does not still mean acceptable levels of crime. And so, yes, I think people are feeling a little bit better about being able to go out right now without being accosted. But at the same time, I think people still look around. They still see the news. They still see, they hear these shocking stories in places like Charlotte, about these brutal stabbings and murders. And they still think, look, I mean, this is not acceptable. Even if the statistics tell one story that things have maybe gotten better in terms of homicides or whatever else, this stuff still shocks the conscience, and it doesn't seem like our leaders really are doing much about it.
Well, it's sort of the, Congress is a big problem, but not my congressman. He or she is not part of the problem.
Exactly.
And so, the large cities, the United States, a supermajority of people think that crime is a major problem. Your community, small town, rural areas, a majority and a supermajority say not. Well, actually, supermajorities in both say not really a problem, or it's a minor problem. And so it's one of those things where, I've tried to impress this upon people. Like, people who live in the suburbs of Chicago, they see what's happening in Chicago and they say, well, yeah, it's a problem in Chicago, so I'm not going to go down there. But that doesn't mean that I believe it's a problem here. It's safe in my community, which it generally speaking is. And also what's happening in Chicago isn't going to change my vote. And then in large cities, they say it's a major problem, but 90% of Republicans think it's getting worse, while just less than 1 in 3 Democrats do. So, so you still have this dynamic where those who are experiencing it, not from a distance, are still have to, like, this is just my interpretation, sort of rationalizing the political choices they make. So it's getting worse, but I'm not going to sort of acknowledge it. And I'm certainly not going to blame the people I voted for, because that would make me part of the problem.
Yeah, well, look, I mean, crime, just like so many other issues right now, is just kind of following the wave of politics, right? So a lot of people's, one of the things that I looked at was I went back to the turn of the century, and basically what the trend line is that whichever party controls the presidency, the other party's voters see crime as a bigger problem during that time. Now, sometimes that does overlap, at other times it doesn't quite as much. But you're right. I mean, look, I think part of the issue here is that, for some people who don't themselves experience crime on a daily basis, they may be more prone to thinking, well, it's not really that big a deal. Like what's everybody so upset about? And I take Washington, D.C., where I lived for over a decade, as an example of this, where, D.C., your experience with crime, and I'm sure it's very similar in a place like Chicago, it very much can depend on what part of the city do you live in, because there are some areas that are quite safe, right? And then there are other areas, areas that are lower income, that have higher rates of poverty. And people in those areas do actually experience crime a lot more frequently, whether it's carjackings or street robberies or whatever else it might be. And, so I think part of this perception gap has to do with what you actually experience on a daily basis. And even in places like D.C., it's probably similar in Chicago, where, there are some kind of common spaces like public transportation or, just busy business districts. You talked about Michigan Avenue. I think of places like DuPont Circle in Washington, D.C., where, yes, these are places that are highly trafficked and, generally safe, and yet you still see stories about shocking crimes happening, stray bullets flying through, or smash and grabs that happen in broad daylight. And all of this just contributes to a sense for a lot of people of just social disorder, that their leaders don't have control of their own streets, of their own cities. And, that kind of creates fertile ground for people to say, you know what, fine, why don't you just bring in the National Guard, bring in the military? What else what could go wrong? Because the status quo isn't working.
Mm-hmm. And just some other things you measure too. You sort of mentioned it. Public transit is another thing in terms of trying to measure what people who actually think about it in the cities. I mean, I look at it from afar. I don't use public transit, but there's enough stories there that suggest I don't want to use public transit either. But for those who do use it on a daily basis, maybe the experience is different, or maybe they separate things like an actual act of violence from just the uneasiness that is attended to it with vagrancy or people that are mentally ill loitering on a train or on a platform.
Yeah, and it's kind of so the survey looks nationally, and I think part of what's a little tricky here is that this may vary a little bit from city to city, right? So in a place like DC, you have actually a pretty cross mix of riders on public transit. You have higher income, working professionals who take public transit. It's faster than taking a car. You have working class, lower income people also taking it, and so it's highly populated. You may be a little bit less likely to see issues on the trains in those cases, but in cities where it's mostly lower income riders, like I'm in Atlanta right now, and most of the people taking it are lower income. Those trains are not very well kept, and you have more kind of incidents in these places. And so to some extent, sure, if you're taking a train on a daily basis, and especially if it's during work hours and commuting hours, and the trains are pretty full, you may not have any issues. But one of the interesting things is that the poll that you're referencing kind of lumps together people who say that public transit is very safe and or somewhat safe. And those are two kind of different sentiments.
Yeah, right.
You might think it's right. You might think it's somewhat safe, but that does mean then you're still kind of looking around and making sure. I mean, I had this experience too. When I would take the metro in DC, I would look around and I would just kind of be keeping my eyes about me and making sure I knew who was around, and I wouldn't get into an empty car if it was late at night and those kinds of things. And so, you feel like if you're in a public space, you just want to know that you're not going to have issues. And for people who have that kind of sense of unease, that just contributes to what's this thought that, what's going on here? Why do I have to be constantly alert just to make sure I get home safely from, my job or from going out in the evening?
With the reaction, the survey research here that I saw when we were at the height of, Trump threatening the National Guard into Chicago was basically majority opposition to it, but particularly among whites in the wealthier areas of the city, much less so among blacks and Latinos in some of the less wealthy areas, which is probably not much of a surprise who's experiencing the crime. But I wonder if you think the Dems go too far, just politically speaking, when they say things like we heard many politicians say that this is all a manufactured crisis. That Trump has manufactured, the typical crime is at a 30-year low in D.C. or Chicago, murders are down and so on and so forth. So this is just a manufactured crisis. I wonder if you think that that works for them, or that is political tone deafness that is dangerous for them politically.
Yeah, I think what's tricky for Democrats is that, we've seen sort of this play out since Trump's first term, which is that there's just this tendency anytime Trump stakes out a position on one side to just take the opposite position. And what it risks doing is putting themselves on the wrong side of public opinion at times on issues that people really care about. And I actually wrote about this today, but on the crime issue specifically, look, I think it's fair to say people can take a nuanced approach to it. You don't have to overstate the reality on the ground, but you should also, realize that people have genuine fears and concern, or just even concerns about their streets, about their public transportation, about even living in their homes safely. And I think what Democrats risk doing here is, if Trump says, you know what, I think crime's a problem, I'm going to take charge of controlling it. And Democrats, instead of saying, well, you might have a point, let's see where we can work together, just say, what are you talking about? Crime's not a problem. Then they do come across as tone deaf, especially in some of these areas, like you mentioned, the lower income areas, areas with a lot of minorities that experience higher crime. They kind of look at the Democrats and they're like, well, what are you talking about? Like, do you not think our concerns are legitimate? And so, I think if they took a little bit more of a balanced approach to saying, well, let's, make sure that we're all working off of the same information, but we also want to be helpful here. We want to make sure that people do live safely. I think people would appreciate that. But right now, so far, especially from leaders, ranging from Chuck Schumer and Hakeem Jeffries in D.C. to even J.B. Pritzker and some of the comments he's made in response to Trump, I don't think you're really seeing that balanced approach right now.
No, and it's it's sort of interesting to watch them have to run cover to the local police departments, like the Chicago Police Department, that many of these same politicians were promoting defunding of just a couple of years earlier.
Yeah.
And
yeah.
No, go ahead.
Yeah, I think I was just going to say, I think, part of what we've seen also in the polling here is that, while people do kind of in the aggregate, they don't want to see necessarily the National Guard basically coming in and taking control of these police departments. They feel for their police. Like, average citizens understand that, like, police resources are strained oftentimes, and that can have an impact. And that, some of that might have been due to the fallout from 2020 and efforts to take away funding from these departments. So, the Associated Press had a poll just this last week that basically asked, do people support Trump using the National Guard to assist local police? And on that measure, it was 55-37 in support, overwhelming support from Republicans, plurality support from independents, and even a third of Democrats were like, you know what? Yeah, I think that's fair. So, I think there is somewhat of a disconnect even between the party's leaders and some of their own voters when it comes to some of these issues.
Michael Baharaeen, Chief Policy Analyst at the Liberal Patriot, also his Substack, michaelbaharaeen.substack.com. Michael, thanks as always for joining us. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you, Dan. Appreciate it.
And he joined us on the Turnkey.pro answer line.
Before you see it on TV, share it on Facebook, or read about it in the paper. Hear it here first. This is Chicago's Morning Answer on AM 560. The Answer. The Dinesh D'Souza Podcast.
This is an important thing to recognize about Trump is he's a very transactional guy. Trump will impose a penalty, and if you come to him and say, well, let's make a deal. This is the actual opposite of socialism. This is called cutting a deal to make something work.